This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
And we are back in the dark room. Sorry, folks, it's been a couple weeks since we last dropped an episode, and we
never apologize. Never apologize. What are you apologizing
I felt bad
for?
about it. Okay.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I felt wonderful. I was delightful. I was in Alaska. I was eating salmon. The sun, the sun never set. It was True Detective day country up there.
Day country.
And no cleaning ladies were harmed in the making of my little sabbatical. We're back. Okay, go ahead, Brad. You got it.
Yeah,
you got it.
Yeah. So we are back in the dark room, and for people who don't know, a dark room episode is, we've covered a lot of subjects on this show in depth, 60 plus, maybe even 70 at this point. Certainly 70 by the time the year is out, season 4 here with us. In the dark room, we bring in somebody else to kind of help us flesh out our ideas, our understanding of a particular subject. And in this case, we've got friend of the show, Dexter De La Paz, at TLE Paz on Twitter, the true heir of Art Bell, the mastermind behind the very powerful Scarlet Thread Society podcast, which you can find under the Timeline Earth feed. Recent episodes of that show include a great episode on psychogeography, an episode on Bitcoin astrology with Glass Delusions, which I found very, very provocative and interesting, and I got to do some more thinking about that for sure. But also guest spots from other people you may know, such as Owen Cyclops and even myself back in the day. So Dexter, thank you so much for joining us. And also I want to just say thank you. You have been a supporter and booster of this show since the early days. And so much respect for that too. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be back here. As you said, I loved what you guys did from the first time I saw you guys. And that was thankfully for me, very early on. It's been a long ride with you guys, and I've loved every minute of it.
Yeah, I'm glad we got you back in here. I realized you've been on twice before, but those were movie watches, and that's just a little different. Those are cool. Those are fun. I think people really enjoyed those. But just a different, just kind of different vibe than this, where we'll have a kind of a chance to talk in depth on some things. We kind of got talking, in the background, thinking about how we could get you on and what we might talk about. And we settled on sort of using Robert E. Howard as a springboard, pulp more generally, as the show has gone on. Old Pulp and Slick, which somehow became Kevin and I's nicknames. I have gotten more and more fascinated with pulp as a genre of literature, as a sort of cultural phenomena. But maybe we can start with sort of Robert E. Howard. When I say Robert E. Howard, Dexter, what does that evoke for you? What does that mean to you?
Well, so what it immediately means to me is that sort of fast-paced, serial, sword and sorcery fiction. It would go on to be one of the biggest influences in fantasy literature ever. Almost everything calls back to him in some way or is in dialogue with him. So the first thing I think is someone muscle-bound with a mighty sword raised or some sort of very stereotypically now, but at the time, something totally new, the dark vizier and the pretty girl.
Yeah, for sure. That's
evocative imagery.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of one of the things that was exciting about it. I mean, when I was doing the research for that episode and in our conversation, there was something so refreshing about revisiting that material and it's sort of like came about before irony. Not really before irony, but everything now has like a touch of irony to it, right?
It is bracingly sincere. And that's
Yes.
not just him, but the other people we'll talk about. It's like it's genuinely, as you said, a breath of fresh air
Yeah.
because it just is what is presented to you. And there's no layer of commentary heaped on top of it, which is what a modern audience expects in everything. And frankly, I think to the detriment of the consumer.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. There is that thing, even like we bag on like MCU stuff and this and yeah, at this point, bagging on that is kind of cliched in and of itself. But one of the things that I think I found most annoying about it, because I grew up reading comic books. So when the
Sure,
MCU
we all
stuff,
did, right?
right. So when the MCU stuff first kicked off, you're like, okay, cool, I'll sort of check this out. And, might as well see what they're doing. And there just comes this point where they're always winking at you about something, right? It's
Yeah, well,
always
so that's actually a perfect example, and I don't want to derail us to talk
no, go
about
ahead.
that right away, but this
Yeah.
sincerity we're talking about. Think about that first Iron Man movie.
Hmm.
This is a rock star lead actor.
Hmm.
This is just a straight up comic book story, and it
Right.
told a comic book story and took itself seriously. And there
Mhm.
wasn't 1,800 callbacks because it was
Right.
one of the first ones.
Right. Yeah, it was just like we're gonna have fun. Some stuff's gonna blow up. There's gonna be some high-tech gee whiz stuff. There'll be some jokes and gags along the way, but we're just kind of here to have a good time, and, and we'll deliver on that promise, right? Which I can sort of which I can respect. But yeah, kind of as it went on, it became very rapidly sort of decrepit as a subgenre, the whole MCU cape shit stuff, and it made me it makes me, want somebody to, and doing the dark, gritty reboot isn't quite what I'm thinking about as a sort of like a return to sincerity. There's something.
No, and that's not either because at this point we don't even as a culture have the means to interact with dark and gritty because at this point it's a cliche in and of itself. Oh, this is the pivot to get your audience as it gets older. It's
Right.
not actually dark and gritty, it's cynical, and that's not the same thing.
Yeah, very well put. Yeah. It's just another angle to hit that nostalgia button. Everybody wants to just get that nostalgia drip, and that's like another way to get it if you've been, gotten sort of tired of the whole thing.
Yeah, that turn to sort of the dark dystopian stuff really, and it hides a certain politics too. It's sort of like, oh my God, George Bush was president for 2 terms. Now Batman has to be this, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and it's, nothing. Sure, okay, fine. I still like those Batman movies, but let's not pretend that isn't in the background.
Oh, sure. There was a whole GWAT thing going on in the background there. And what does this mean about Al Qaeda and the NSA? And
oh yeah,
great
for
flicks,
sure.
but come on now.
Is torture maybe torture in some maybe we got to torture people sometimes,
right?
Maybe you have to throw the Joker off that building.
Right. This is another thing I respect about the pulp stuff is like oftentimes Robert E. Howard and Lovecraft and the rest of them, it's not really commentary on anything.
Yeah, no, today's audience wants to read a lot of like xenophobia back into Lovecraft because of what we know about his opinions and his personal letters. But if you sit down and you read his stories, he's telling you a story about an indescribable horror.
Right.
This has got nothing to do with the politics you're talking about.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And I think that's why he kind of became somewhat uncancelable. There is like a whole weird fiction world, and they put an asterisk next to Lovecraft's name because of his personal opinions on race and other matters, but like they all still read the stuff and respect it, and they're all conscious of being, aesthetically downstream of him in a certain way. And yeah, you can't dislodge him at all, really, which is interesting. And Robert E. Howard had his own, he had his own sort of complicated opinions on race, and we went into that in the core episode. But you can read these things, and none of that stuff, unless you're one of these all art is political or everything is political people, you don't really have to live on that plane of analysis. You shouldn't even begin.
And I
You
don't
shouldn't
want
even
to
be
offend
analyzing this
anyone
stuff at all.
hearing this, but
Yeah.
like, if that is who you are, what on earth are you doing with your life? Like, come on.
Right, exactly.
Well, there's this weird thing too, in and out of that recession that happened where Hollywood still wants to make money. It's an industry, of course. It's the business. They want to make millions of billions of dollars, and you have these brands that they have to protect and revive and guard and rehash and just absolutely drain every ounce of cash from that they possibly can. But then you have this circumstance where the world kind of went to hell in 2008. Like people were losing their homes, they were losing their cars, they were losing their jobs. So it's like, how do you make a blockbuster for that era? Well, you sort of apologize for making a blockbuster by editorializing as you do it. Do you know, like this is why it's such a cheap cheat for people to make these political speeches at the Oscars. They wear their $20,000 dresses and then insert political costs. It's like a cheap out where you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. And we go along with it too. I mean, I want to go see a big blockbuster. I mean, people, the show will go on. If we head into another recession or a depression, people still go to the damn movies, So it's like, sort of, how do you square that circle?
Yeah.
Well, you editorialize inside the content.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point, because as I read the history of pulp, and we're gonna, we've got some directions we're gonna go in this conversation, but as I read like the history of pulp, the publication history of it, the real, especially Weird Tales, where Robert E. Howard made most of his appearances, or most of his sort of enduring stories were first appeared, that a lot of that stuff was response to the Depression. I mean, this was all happening very early 30s. It was kicking off, and I think there was an escapist tendency among people, which I don't denigrate the way some people do. There's people who are sort of, oh, well, that's just escapism. It's like, what? Isn't that what? There's like a great
entire point here, right?
Yeah, isn't that what? There's a great.
Well, it can see it being like a masculine power fantasy as well. Like the banks have taken over. Men can't be men anymore. The West has been cordoned off. So now we're going to escape into a fantasy where I can conquer your village, take your women, cleave your head in twain. And meantime, my father lost the farm.
Right. And I don't have any idea what to do with my life in this sort of industrialized,
reduced to wages, which the majority of people weren't prior to the 1870s, 1880s. People were yeoman farmers. People farmed.
They did day work or whatever. They were someone's farmhand.
Yeah.
I want to stop it. And Brad, you're on a roll here,
go ahead.
but I wanted to get this in. Dexter, I've been listening to Timeline Earth, and I have to say, I want to pitch that show to people here real quick who don't know what that is, and now Scarlet Thread is. Yeah. I got to tell you, the theme song for Timeline Earth always makes me laugh because whoever did it rhymed girth with earth. I love it. Tell people about that show real quick.
The podcast collective, I guess, is the most appropriate word that I am a part of, is called Timeline Earth. It is a weekly show in which we take a comedic, not just stab, but full-on aggravated assault at the news, and with a very, very humorous tone. There are some very vague, libertarian, tongue-in-cheek things. You will see us go, pardon the crude language, balls to the wall for both Biden and Trump. We literally flip a coin each week to decide who we're supporting, and then we are their number one guys. And please understand, it's a bit. The humor is a little coarse, but what we've been telling everyone is, if you don't get it at first, the first episode you listen to, you're going to hate our show. The second one, you're going to hate listen to us. And by the third one, you're going to start getting it. And if you can make it through 5 episodes, you'll be our biggest fan.
You sound like a man who's used a lot of dating apps when you're pitching that, right? It's just you just got to get to the third date, honey. Right. You're gonna love me on the third date.
That's right.
Yeah. So my own role there, I'm a little bit sort of the straight man. A lot of times I'm the one who gives out the exasperated scream of pain at whatever news story we're covering, and then we get back on topic.
Right.
In terms of my Go ahead,
Oh, go ahead.
please.
No, I was just gonna say I love the conceit of just like we're gonna flip a coin and pick which side we're on for the day. Like that's I find that hilarious. So
Yeah, I did too when I dreamed it up for him. In addition to that, all four of us have a sub brand. Mine is the Scarlet Thread Society. I was not reared on Art Bell, but he did shape my young adulthood. I listened to uncountable hours of Coast to Coast AM reruns. So I am deep into that conspiracy theory world. And with my own part of the Timeline Earth project, I like to really examine some of that stuff. I'm not coming at it to debunk it. I don't believe very much of it uncritically, but I have a sufficiently open mind to believe that cliche saying people always trot out that an extraordinary claim demands extraordinary evidence. But the difference between me and a lot of people is I look at the propaganda machine in the media world and say, this is your extraordinary claim, and you never gave me extraordinary evidence.
Yes.
So a lot of people might call me a conspiracy theorist, and that's true. I am, but I'm a little bit more reasonable than the kook you're picturing in your head.
Yeah. I mean, if he got to 2024 and there aren't at least a smattering of conspiracy or parapolitical things that you kind of buy into, you haven't really been paying attention. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and parapolitical is a good way to put it too. Like you were saying, I've done recent episodes on psychogeography, how people's belief seeps into the dirt. Bitcoin astrology, and it's not just Bitcoin. You know, corporate astrology is a massive industry too. There's the famous saying attributed to, I think, one of the Rockefellers, one of the DuPonts, one of those big money guys. Millionaires have analysts, billionaires have astrologists or whatever. So, you know, it's just a lot of that stuff. That's a lot of what I do and a lot of what we do.
Yeah, no, the Bitcoin astrology episode is fantastic. I mean, that's such a
I need to listen. I need to listen to that one.
Check that out.
Dexter, I've been in crypto since 2020, kind of full time. So I'll give that a listen. Yeah, everybody needs to have a theory about Bitcoin at all times.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, that one might give you a stroke, so I'm sorry in advance. It's pretty exotic, but it was so much fun to record.
I don't know if Kevin had been paying attention to the astrological implications. Those returns might have been even higher.
Yeah,
it's hard to say.
Yeah, I'm gonna. We'll see. There's still time. The market, the casino isn't going to close anytime soon. But this isn't a crypto podcast. Yeah. This is a podcast about the dark side of creativity. Dexter, I love that you all are doing like a Wu-Tang thing with your podcast collective. That's very cool. And people really should check out Timeline Earth if you haven't. Listen to it at least 3 times.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, at least 3 times.
And now this might be a good segue. You had mentioned when we were talking in the DMs, Dexter, that you wanted to fold M.R. James into this conversation because you'd been doing some research on him. I'm assuming for Scarlet Thread Society or for, I don't know, maybe for something else, but who was M.R. James? Why should we know about him? I mean,
well,
who
is
this?
Just
who's this guy?
Right? Who is this guy? That gentleman that I did psychogeography with, the fella that I talked to, he's quickly becoming a very personal friend. He recommended M.R. James to me as just someone to read because he was a good writer, and I knew nothing about this guy. And so I go to one of those sites and get a collection of his short stories, and I start digging through it. And at this point, I'm just reading his stories. I still have not Googled his name because I want to be fresh and with no opinions other than his authorship when I do it. And I'm reading, and these are some of the best ghost stories I've ever heard. And then I'm getting this vibe in my head. I'm getting this feeling, this sensation that, man, this just all seems so familiar. And the first thing I thought of was, this is just like the sort of material you'd find in a horror pulp. Just like it.
Yeah.
And so then I do finally search him once I finished the collection that I had. And I find out, okay, so he's born in the 1860s. He passes away there in the 1930s. And he didn't even really write ghost stories to write ghost stories. What he actually was a medievalist and an academic in England. He worked at, it was Cambridge and Eton College. He was the son of an Anglican minister. And these ghost stories, you guys might know this, you might not know this. In the Anglo culture over there in the UK, Christmas is their spooky season. That's when you gather up, you tell your ghost stories, you spook each other just a little bit, and you get a moral story from it.
And so I got to pause here. Sorry, Dexter. I got to pause and say, like, Eton is like their Exeter. Eton is where all the prime ministers, all the like. Eton is like it is Eton College, but it's like a boarding high school. Very, very, very prestigious. As high as it gets. Okay. Yeah,
okay. Go on, see, and I didn't Dexter. Have that context for it, so it speaks that much more to his credit that he was there then.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Go on, Dexter.
So he's writing these stories, but he's writing them to tell his friends and family in the holiday season. And at some point, as he's in his adulthood and as he's maturing, he's got this friend who's an illustrator who's just begging him to publish these works. And he says to the guy, well, if you'll illustrate them, I'll do it. And so he did. And that's where this material comes from. But they were just that. They were these short stories. They were little seasonal things. They had their specific purpose. Hey, gather up Christmas Eve, tell this story. And the rest of the time he was writing prolifically in academia. And he had a focus on manuscript work. And so that's what a lot of that's dedicated to. And
I saw there's like a lot of like
some of the stories.
I saw there's like a lot of surveys of like all the manuscripts described in this one library or something.
Yeah. And that was the majority of his work. And, you know, the internet says that it's a reasonable conclusion to take that he was very well respected in his field and he was excellent at it and he should be well known for that. But really, he should be known as a ghost story author because these collections are tremendous. And when you see that he was actually preceding a lot of these other guys we were talking about, like Howard, like Lovecraft, like the Weird Tales set, it became obvious to me that perhaps this is incorrect, that he was a direct influence on a lot of them, because this is also the sort of guy that they would have been reading themselves. And we can say, as a matter of the historical record, I don't know if it came up in your Lovecraft episode. I'm saying I don't know because I can't remember. I did listen to it.
No. There's a lot of material there.
That James was an influence on him. And there's some reason to believe they may have even been in dialogue with each other.
Yeah, it's possible that they did write to each other. I mean, they were alive. M.R. James was older, but Lovecraft died in 1937. M.R. James died in 1936. So they certainly could have been in correspondence. Lovecraft did, so people may know, Lovecraft had a very long form, almost book-length essay called Supernatural Horror in Literature. And he devotes half a dozen paragraphs to M.R. James. And he basically what you're saying, he basically saying that he's like a, what would you call it? He's sort of a touchstone within the history of supernatural horror, and also kind of represents something like an inflection point, because prior to M.R. James, there were things, supernatural horror or horror tended to have a more gothic streak to it, and M.R. James kind of didn't remove that entirely, but kind of pulled it out of the bodice ripper style, sort of salacious for salaciousness sake direction that a lot of that work was headed in sort of the late 19th century. So yeah, he was a huge influence on Lovecraft.
I mean, let's be real though, like bodices are meant to be ripped.
Well, yeah,
they totally are. There's no question.
Designed for, right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So you're right in that a lot of his tales are just significantly cleaner. There's not a lot of that scandalousness to it. You can tell that when you know what they were designed for, it's immediately obvious. But if you picked it up at random, you wouldn't think that it was writing to sell, even in that time, because that's just not what it's about. Which is probably what you can attribute the moderate lack of commercial success to for a lot of it. As far as I know, he wasn't deriving income from his ghost stories or not enough. It came from his salaries and his scholarly work.
Right, right. Now he actually, I was doing some reading on him. He actually articulated, and maybe you were going to get to this, but he articulated this method of storytelling that has since been come to be called Jamesian. And I'll just give it to you really quick. It's basically got three aspects to it. The first is a characterful, that's a hard word to say, characterful setting in an English village, seaside town, or country estate, an ancient town in France, Denmark, or Sweden. Right, so a very distinctive setting. The second one is a nondescript and rather naive gentleman scholar as a protagonist. And three is the discovery of an old book or other antiquarian object that somehow unlocks, calls down the wrath, or at least attracts the unwelcome attention of a supernatural menace.
Yeah, I was going to get to that, but having you just read it right there and make it very clear for the audience, that's great. And this is one of the things I was talking about where it really caught me. Like, where have I seen this stuff before? Because you see those themes so heavily in a lot of the pulp and in the weird tales, and you see it today. And a lot of people attribute those things to Lovecraft. But here is where they're actually coming from.
Yes.
And I've got to say, they're some of my favorite themes, too. I mean, who doesn't love a story about the skeptical scholar who gets in over his head?
Yeah.
It's just a delicious, I think trope's a fair word for it. Is that the right term?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It's all the way through to X-Files. You've got Scully, who just doesn't, what is that show if you don't have her as the partner disbelieving? I mean, that's the show. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think from a sort of just a narrative storytelling standpoint, if you're going to do something that sort of, breaks the rules of laws of physics or whatever, having a straight man or straight, in Scully's case, straight woman as a sort of foil for that, as a sort of stand-in for the audience or whatever, I think is kind of important for making it a coherent story. Right. Otherwise, you can't just have everybody running around believing everything as soon as it happens. It's
no,
kind
you really
of loses
can't,
its
especially in a ghost story, right? It's that disbelief that makes the big reveal hit in Act 2 or Act 3, wherever it's discovered that, oh my gosh, this is really happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes me think too, and Dexter, I don't necessarily expect you to be as familiar with this, but this is something that Borges did a lot as well. And we're talking Lovecraft in the pulps, and M.R. James is writing these sort of ghost stories. And then Borges is, is respected amongst the highest brows out there, right, as a literary figure. And he used this model in at least a half a dozen short stories that I can think of. He used these Jamesian rules, deliberately or not, probably on purpose, knowing about M.R. James's work, just having an understanding of how literate Borges was. So this stuff, and Kevin, like you said, X-Files too, right? This stuff, this was like a major archetypical method. Twin Peaks,
absolutely, and of course, True Detective, all of them.
Yeah, it's so burned into the way we do this sort of story now, you don't even see that it's there in something distinct. It's almost timeless, despite the fact that it's only 140, 160 years old stylistically.
Yeah,
it's super modern. I mean, you can't really divorce this style from modernity itself, which That's is true, I'd really be curious to hear from a French literary person what Poe and Lovecraft mean to them in translation. I know it's they're way more important over there, or as important over there as they are here. I think people have finally come around and figured it out over here, but I know certainly Poe, everyone reads him in France, and then Wallach has that essay on Lovecraft.
Yeah. I mean, they're understood as almost, to my understanding, the French have a sense of those figures as closer to the surrealists and the symbolists than we do in America. In America, we think of them as tellers of spooky, ooky tales, which they are. But yeah, in France, they sort of fit them in a slightly different slot on the shelf than we do, which I think is pretty fascinating.
And just thinking about it, I can even see the case for doing that. I'm an American. It is not my primary academic field, so I can't really comment on it as thoroughly as you guys or an actual scholar these people can, but I can see the case for it, just sitting here talking about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, Lovecraft is, there's a whole, you can read the unnameable, undescribable horror. I mean, you can see that as just, oh, that's a crazy monster, but you can also think of that as like the modernity, like the modern era emerging, right? And being terrified.
And that's where a lot of his flack comes from too, right? Because you see this thing he didn't put a name on, so you can put whatever name you want on it, and all of a sudden he's a supervillain to you.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, tell us about can you tell us about one or two specific M.R. James stories, just, recommendations for audience? I have a feeling that very few people that listen to our show have actually read an M.R. James story. So what are some that they might want to read?
So the number one that I absolutely have to recommend is the one we talked about earlier, the Mezzotint.
Yeah.
This one has been rent-free in my head for 3 weeks now since I read it.
It's very good.
And it is one of the spookiest stories I've ever read. And the idea is that this academic, he's sitting around the dorms, he's sitting around the staff rooms, and this auction house manager or this appraiser wants to send him something, and he wants him to take a look at it. And it's a mezzotint. And for people who don't know what that is, it's like a sort of engraved image sort of deal. It's black and white. It's supposed to be very full of life. I don't think I've ever seen one in the flesh, but I can kind of get the idea. I described it to someone as halfway to a postcard, and that's really not right at all, but you don't really have a word for it till you see them.
Right. Yeah, black and white. This is back when they had like all kinds of different ways to try and make, what later everything was just photographs.
Yeah, pictures before you had pictures. But so they want this thing appraised. He wants them to take a look at it. It's an image of a country manor. And he gets it, and he's showing it off, and he's talking to people about it. And there's this figure in the field next to the house in the image. Well, they put it down, they think nothing of it, but the next time they take it out to look at it, the figure's closer. And then the next time they do, all of a sudden the figure's crawling towards the house. And then all of a sudden the windows open on the house. And then all of a sudden the figure's gone, but the door is standing wide open. And they're so horrified by it that they never take it out again. And, that seems like, okay, just sitting here listening to me give you the summary doesn't capture the energy of it. Right. Because when you actually read it, you're right there with them. You're looking at the image. It's evocative. And oh my gosh, what is this thing? What is it doing? And it never gets named, just that it's getting closer to the house.
Yeah. No, it is genuinely creepy. So I just read it a day or two ago for the first time. That story is and there's interesting stuff going on too, like about the main character, who is this sort of gentleman scholar, not super skeptical, but he's looking for rational explanations, which there aren't any, of course. He at one point gets other guys to look at it and makes them sign their own description of what's in the mezzotint.
Yeah, so he's like taking these, whatever the legal document is, affidavits. He's taking affidavits. This is what the image looked like when I examined it.
Right. Yeah, and then the next day the window's open. It's like, what is going on? And I kind of liked it. One thing about it that feels like a very modern turn is it doesn't really get resolved. There's just
it just ends. The story just ends with the image locked in a cabinet or in a drawer or something.
Yeah, it's not explained. There's no real climax except the gradual acceptance that this is actually happening. And then you're just left with this like unsettled, unresolved feeling that is very, very effective. I would love to listen to that in 1902 or whenever he wrote it,
that is one specifically that I think is ripe for an audio drama, actually.
Yeah,
I think that'd be a great format for it.
Yeah,
Well,
folks.
do it, and then give it to my theater company, badmouthtc.com,
There you go.
badmouththeatercompany.com. Come on, let's go. Yeah, and it's got to be in the public domain, right? And this is called
All of his work is all of his
Yeah.
ghost
amazing,
stories. Yeah.
amazing. And this story is called,
The
what was it?
mezzotint.
The mezzotint. I'm looking it up right now. What a mezzotint is.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
It's like
an engraving sort of deal. I
Yeah.
called it a postcard, and that's not even remotely right. It's
Yeah.
just not, but I wouldn't know what else
Kevin,
to call it.
it's an intaglio.
Yeah, see, I don't know that word. I'll take your word for it.
I don't know what that is either. I just know it's a word that has something to do with it. Like a daguerreotype.
Sounds like a type of pasta, intaglio.
Very good.
I saw a tweet recently.
tasty.
I saw a tweet that went viral recently. This is a total aside, but it was hilarious. It was like something like ravioli is low key goated when you want 3 of a thing you were expecting to get 10 of.
Well, and there's even something to that too.
Have you ever been to an Italian restaurant? You order a ravioli, you get like 4 ravioli.
Yeah.
It's like,
But at least they usually end up being pretty freaking big too, though.
Yeah.
right.
Big old pillow
Okay.
noodles.
Yeah, the ravioli. Okay, well, that was an asterisk. Yeah. Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah. So, is there any other MR James stories that you can pitch to us or try to get that you would recommend?
I've got 2 more I could give you, but in the interest of time and however you want to format this, we'll start with one if you want to stop after that.
Okay. Yeah.
The other one that I consider to be an absolute must read is called Canon Albrecht's Scrapbook.
Ooh, okay.
And this is about a scholar, the classic Jamesian gentleman scholar that we've established now.
Yeah.
He's on a vacation in France, and he's exploring this cathedral, and he's studying it. He's taking notes on it. He's relaxing by doing academic stuff, as this sort of character would.
Mm-hmm.
But he gets talking to this deacon, this church landkeeper, this sort of figure that's deeply entwined with the earth and the building itself. And he notes how this guy's just super, super jittery. And he thinks nothing of it at the time, but then he brings up this book. Well, we've got this book. Would you want to study it? Do you want it? Okay, I have it at my house. Come back with me. It's 3 minutes away. And so, sure, this guy wants it. He wants to study it. Oh, what sort of ancient goodies are going to be in this? It belonged to the guy who ran this church XYZ decades, centuries ago, but it's got all sorts of neat stuff. And he gets to the guy's house, and the guy's daughter is there, and the guy's daughter's just as jumpy. And they're like panicking, and they're talking about the book, and they give it to him. And he's insisting, let me give you some money for it. And they're like, no, it's so good that you want this. You can have this. This is wonderful. And he insists, well, let me give you a little bit of money. And so they take the money, not for the book, but just to be rid of the book. And this guy's totally oblivious to it. And so he gets back to his hotel, and he starts reading it. And that's where the trouble sets in, because something was within the book. And then the last section of the story is just him being chased about the room, and him and the hotel staff being not quite assaulted by this monster, this demon, this creature, this other is the appropriate word with a capital O, right? And then in the story of many, or in the fashion of it, many of the other stories, it's just over. The next morning comes. Well, what happened to him after that? What happened to the book? What was actually in the book?
Right.
And
you don't get any of that, right?
Yeah, there's no ending to these stories. Yeah. And I love that, because in horror, that creates the sensation of, well, it didn't end. Is the ending in the room right here with me now? Did me reading the book? This guy read the book he wasn't supposed to. Was I supposed to read this? Am I next? It's that sort of creeping dread sensation you get when there's no closure to something.
Yes.
And this guy was just a master of that.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I like that too, because you got to think about like what is, and it all makes sense in the context of when, I'm sure at some point he started writing these stories sort of for their own sake, but you take the original context of them for telling ghost stories around the campfire, or around the Christmas celebration, and you're not going for a fully encapsulated story. You're going for a specific effect. You
Yeah, you
want
want to
people.
hammer someone with a jump scare or
Right,
something.
right. Yeah. So leaving it kind of unresolved like that, it lets it kind of live on as like a little piece of folklore.
Can you
I think
imagine blowing out your candles and having to go to bed after having read the mezzotint? Like,
right,
what?
right. It's fantastic. I want to read this quote from M.R. James, just about writing about stories and about, I think specifically we can see his sort of influence on pulp from this quote. Reticence may be an elderly doctrine to preach, yet from the artistic point of view, I am sure it is a sound one. Reticence conduces to effect. Blatancy ruins it. And there's much blatancy in a lot of recent stories. They drag in sex too, which is a fatal mistake. Sex is tiresome enough in the novels. In a ghost story, or as the backbone of a ghost story, I have no patience with it. At the same time, don't let us be mild and drab. Malevolence and terror, the glare of evil faces, the stony grin of unearthly malice, pursuing forms in darkness, and long drawn distant screams are all in place, and so is a modicum of blood shed with deliberation and carefully husbanded. The weltering and wallowing that I too often encounter merely recall the methods of M.G. Lewis, some other writer. And it makes me think of one of the reasons that a movie, for instance, like Alien worked so well is that control about when do you see the monster, right? And the fact that the effect you're going for is all about the fear, and there's so much more fear and anticipation than there is in the thing actually happening, right? And I think it's sort of an amateur move is to have the monster on the first page, and then everything else is sort of dealing with it. And I don't know if before, I don't know that M.R. James invented this notion of reticence, but it feels like he really perfected it in the context of a ghost story or a horror story.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. A thought that just kind of bubbled up to me last night was
Mhm.
I was thinking about this solely because it's one of my favorite movies. So maybe it can be discarded as a favoritism or a sort of
Yeah.
recency bias. But I thought of John Carpenter's Halloween and Michael
Mm,
Myers in this sort of veil.
mm,
Sure, he appears in the first couple opening scenes, but the whole thing about that boogeyman specifically and other boogeyman type horror movies is that it's just a shape or just a face chasing you for so much of it. And at
mhm.
least early on in the slasher craze, there was a lot more held in than it got to be later in things like Nightmare on Elm Street, where it's just blood and tits.
Yeah.
But especially early on, it's like, oh my gosh, we are being pursued by something unknowable. And
Right.
I'm trying to recall the lore correctly. Supposedly, in the script of Halloween, it wasn't even Michael Myers, it was just the shape.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of like that. That would have been
I
that would have been
love
interesting
stuff
too.
like that. I
Yeah.
love stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The less you
So
see
I
of the
don't know
thing.
that that's a direct connection or it's directly attributable, but it
Mhm.
immediately sort of calls to mind that sort of thing. And I need to chew on it more, but I think there's something there.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a lineage, and I mean, this is kind of one thing that I'm wanting to understand better, and is the influence of there's clearly this direct line from M.R. James to the pulps of Weird Tales and other pulp magazines of the 20s and 30s. But I think that lineage does certainly, kind of as the pulp era dwindles and cinema, you know, grows, I think the unspeakable thing at the heart of pulp spreads out into all these different subgenres of film, and slasher films for sure. I mean, I wouldn't I don't know what the first slasher film is, but for instance, I know Psycho, the book for Psycho was written by Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch's got his career start in Weird Tales, right? And then how many
Mhm.
things have been influenced by the film Psycho? Um, Countless,
Yeah,
really.
exactly.
Yeah. So So that stuff, that DNA from M.R. James, I think, does pass through, through Weird Tales and then on into films as seemingly diverse as Alien and Halloween.
Well, and Brad, and we're going on a podcast this weekend to talk about Point Omega from Don DeLillo. What's the name of the podcast? What is it that we're going
Book
on?
Club from Hell.
Book Club from Hell.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about Don DeLillo's Great Point Omega, which is based on or heavily inspired by a real world art installation where Psycho, the film, was slowed to 24 hours exactly, frame by frame. It was slowed way, way down. So it was 2 frames a second?
I think that's right. Yeah.
And so it would go exactly 24 hours, and Don DeLillo wrote a novel based on it. So you've got this direct thread from the lowest of the low, the pulpiest of the pulp, all the way to the highest of the high in terms of, I guess, literary status is Don DeLillo. And
Don DeLillo is like a perennial Nobel laureate candidate.
Sure, right.
Yeah.
And he ultimately should win the Nobel. But that does beg the question: what's high, what's low? Who decides? Point Omega kind of has the feeling of a pulp. It's a pulpy novel. It's a mystery, and anyway, it's a bit of a pot boiler in its own way.
Yeah,
a pot boiler for guys like us.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is what's, I think, so fascinating about the pulp era. Lovecraft, Howard, Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith, who we're going to talk about in the After Dark. They're, for the literary history nerds out there, and I know we've got some in the audience because we're literary history nerds. One thing to keep in mind is that the pulp craze, and let's just kind of wrap Weird Tales around that, was basically happening at the same time that all of the literary modernism, capital L, capital M stuff was going on. I mean, I think Ulysses came out in 1922, and then Weird Tales' first issue came out in 1923. These are trends running in parallel, and people like Lovecraft and like M.R. James, I'm sure actually M.R. James thought that James Joyce was a bunch of bullshit, actually, which I think is interesting. It's an interesting take. But my point is, these things are all running concurrently. Like Clark Ashton Smith was reading the modernists, and H.P. Lovecraft was reading people like M.R. James, but he was reading a bunch of other 19th century, what we would call high literature. And then he was sitting in his room at night writing the craziest monster stories anybody had ever cooked up. So that, I think the pulp phenomena is a really good thing to point at when people get too pretentious about their literature, right? When it gets a little too
agree
snooty.
with that more.
Yeah. It's sort of like, well, hold on a second. You know that there was a 28-year-old guy in Texas that invented a genre that is now, a $1 billion industry.
The direct ancestor of all the highfalutin stuff you love.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's what makes it such a fascinating part of American. M.R. James is an Englishman, but fascinating part of the literary history. One thing I did want to talk about for a second, and I caught this as I was scrolling around right before we got started. One of the reasons I think M.R. James, and if that point hasn't already been made, was writing these stories about a scholar finding a book or some antiquarian object. That's how he spent his days. And in fact, one of the books he is responsible for editing and putting together is a 1920 edition of the Apocryphal New Testament.
Yes.
And I just rolling through the table of contents, and this is before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, I believe, because I think that happened in the 1940s. But yeah, I mean, this is a 600 some odd page book where he has, scrolled through the archives and found all of these bits and bobs that could have, through whatever process, were candidates or purported to be parts of the New Testament. I just think that's a fascinating, you've got this guy who spends all of his time poring over these old books, and one of the things that comes out of it is he's sort of waiting for something truly bizarre to come out of them, right? This is kind of what these books, these ghost stories, the conceit of them is. Um, so yeah, what a fascinating man, right? To he's got an entire illustrious career doing this medieval scholarly work, and then yet he's writing very middle-brow but brilliant uh ghost stories, spooky ooky stories to make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. I love it.
So you guys would know better than I would, but that's kind of why they say write what you know, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the idea right there, because these characters he's putting in his story are probably how he saw himself as a younger man, or what he perceived his younger self to be, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And you got to wonder, did he ever find an antiquarian object that was a little
Yeah,
weird,
and would he admit it if
right?
he actually had?
Right. He's got his whole career dependent on being a very rational, scholarly gentleman, right?
And
Um,
if I can just sidebar on that
mhm,
exact thought for a moment here,
mhm,
I would also point out that the period in which he is active was a huge occult renaissance in the UK. That is
mhm.
the prime time of the Golden Dawn.
Right.
And being the faithful Anglican that he was and the son of a clergyman, there's almost no chance he was participating. But given the places he worked and the places he was and the field he was in, it was almost certain that he was consistently rubbing shoulders with these types. And he's got another story I haven't gotten to yet called Casting the Runes. And I
Ooh,
am
okay.
told under good authority that if you know what you're looking at and you know the characters involved, it's almost certainly a direct shot at early career Crowley.
Okay. Cool.
So there's
Excellent.
maybe even something to that stuff too.
It's been a
Kevin's
while since I've.
Kevin's contractually obligated to play air guitar whenever Crowley comes up.
That's
No,
it.
that's
That's it.
that's super interesting. Well, yeah, all these guys are sort of there's it's a small world ultimately. And so of course they're gonna kind of know each other and influence each other to some degree. Yeah. Yeah. Well, folks, definitely check out some MR James if this appeals to you. There's clearly, and I'm glad you introduced me to him, Paz, because now I feel like I'm over the course of us doing this show. There are some threads that I'm trying to figure out sort of gradually over time. And one of them is just, what is this pulp phenomena? And now I feel like I got some of the DNA sort of decoded now. And this is really kind of opening my eyes to how this whole thing worked. I think we're kind of approaching the end of our hour here. Folks, join us on the other side of the paywall, patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. Substack.com/@artofdarkpod. You'll get access to this 20 to 30 minute bonus content that we do for each and every episode. And we try to keep something cool and interesting there for you. But you also get access to the book club coming up in July. We are going to be meeting in the Zoom room to discuss Stella Maris and The Passenger, Cormac McCarthy's final two novels. That will be a good time. That's July 13th. If you can't make it and you're a paid subscriber, you'll get access to the audio. You'll at least get to listen to it, and you can listen to all the previous meetings that we had. And some of those are fantastic conversations. Our audience brings the heat. You also get access to the occasional watch along party that we do. You'll get early access to live show tickets. We've got a live show coming up in Hamtramck, October 26th, talking about Harry Houdini. It's going to be a little bit of a Halloween party, so definitely keep your eyes peeled for that. What else, Kevin? Am I missing anything?
I just want to let people know I'm going as a twink who's experienced twink death
No.
for Halloween.
Oh no.
That's and I really mean that.
I'm sorry.
It's going to be great. People, you really have to come out. It's going to be incredible.
Yeah.
Dexter, I don't know if you'll be able to make it to Detroit, but I hope you can. And we more and more we want to do like I think one of these years we're going to do like a mini tour. We're going to try 3 cities in a week or 10 days. We'll figure it out, but definitely think about that Detroit date. That's in October 26th, in the foul year of our Lord 2024. Book club, like Brad said, we've got the McCarthy stuff coming up. The link is at the website artofdarkpod.com. Dexter, give people your plugs. Where can people find your stuff? Then we'll come back for the After Dark.
So the place I am most active, and you can find me nearly 24/7, is on Twitter, now X, colloquially known as the Hell Site. As we said in the beginning, at TLE Paz. You can find me on almost any podcatcher a human on the planet uses under the Timeline Earth show header. I am on almost weekly, and there is dedicated content to my personal interests once a month under the imprint Scarlet Thread Society. Other news, I just set up a Patreon of my own. It's fitting to talk about it now, and I promise I didn't steal this idea from you guys. A listener asked me to do it. I've started a book club of the sort of stuff that I read to get ready for my episodes for Scarlet Thread Society.
Oh, cool. That sounds awesome. Yeah. What can you tell us? Any upcoming topics on Scarlet Thread Society?
Yeah. So releasing by the end of the month here is Psychogeography Part 2.
Oh, cool.
And I guess I don't know when you guys are putting this out, so maybe we need some timestamp editing here. Depending.
No, it'll be out. If it's out, we pretty much turn it right around and put it out. So
okay.
Yeah.
So the end of June here is the second part of Psychogeography and M.R. James.
Cool. Awesome.
My obsession with him has been what led to this fortuitous meeting between us.
Yeah.
So that's the topic this month. Next month, I'm getting back into the dark side of conventional history, going to do something on early state formation and why alchemists are responsible for Westphalia or some such nonsense. Something related, maybe not that exactly. But something in that sort of vein. August, maybe do some economic doomerism in the classic zero hedge, but with lizardmen style. Who knows? We get weird, we get fun.
Yeah,
that's awesome, Dexter. I got to tell you too, and this is sort of self-serving, but I have a new radio play coming out that's very much on theme for this. It's like an AI horror, sort of techno horror, neo Lovecraftian radio play in 2 parts. It's coming out this summer. It's called Basilisk. I wrote it with Abby Lucas, who was on our Bolaño episode. So keep an eye out for that. That's going to be really fun. We'll do some stuff around that here on the pod. But awesome. And listen, everybody, go and listen to 3 episodes of Timeline Earth. Yes. It's really started to grow on me after 3, 4, 5 episodes.
Yeah, it takes that long, but thank you.
Hey, all good things.
Back on the After Dark. Yeah, there you go. All right. See you in a minute. Bye.